Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I'm a senior associate here at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is a temporary non-immigrant visa that offers a pathway for investors and entrepreneurs looking to live and work in the U.S. Just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E-2 visa and has been on several different visas, including the F1, a TN, a B, and H-1B. As such, we know what you are going through. Scott Legal PC is a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in several different areas, including E-2, E-1, TN, L-1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB-5, extraordinary eligibility visas, and more. We have processed hundreds of E-2 visas and typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We have processed at consulates around the world, but primarily we process at Toronto and London. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. So at the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download the guide that goes through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We will also send a link for that. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We'll also send a link where you can arrange a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. So today we are lucky to have with us Kelly Weiner. She is a partner here at Scott Legal, and she has extensive experience processing employment-based visas to include the E-2. So without further delay, let us get started with the webinar.
Thank you, Katie. So we can go to the first slide. Perfect. So we're going to get started today by talking about the E-2 visa requirements and what they are. So the E-2 visa is an investor visa, and it is based on nationality, meaning the passport that you hold for a particular country. So in order to qualify for an E-2 visa, you first must be a national of a treaty country. And there are over 80 E-2 treaty countries, including countries from Europe, Africa, Asia, South America, the Middle East, and North America. And they change over time. So sometimes they're added, sometimes they're taken off. For example, Iran was on the list, but it's no longer on the list. New Zealand and Israel were added, in the last few years. So it is important to kind of check the list to make sure that you're still on the list. If you are a treaty country national, you have to own at least 50% in the company to make it an E-2 company. You also have to make a substantial investment. So this is the investor part of the visa. You must put your funds at risk. This means money has to actually be spent. It's not possible to get the visa by opening a business bank account and just transferring a lump sum of cash. You have to put the money, it has to be at risk and irrevocably committed to the commercial enterprise in order to count as investment. You also have to prove that your investment has a legitimate source of funds. So that didn't come from any kind of criminal activity. So this can be personal savings from employment. It can be a gift from a friend or family member, sale of a house, a personal loan, as long as it's not secured by the assets of the E-2 company. So let's say you took out a home equity line of credit, or a personal unsecured line of credit. That could be the source of funds as well. How much is enough? This is a big question that we'll talk about in later slides. Typical expenditures, you're going to think about, what do I need to get this type of business up and running? So it will be specific to your type of business. The things you're spending money on if you're opening a coffee shop are different than if you're opening up a manufacturing plant, are different than if you're opening up a consulting company. That being said, there are some typical expenditures most businesses need. So things like inventory, computer equipment, a working website, office supplies, printer, scanner, pens, paper. um, office or warehouse rent, which it needs to be an actual commercial space. So people sometimes ask, can I use like I work at home, can I use my personal rent? No, they won't consider that. Things like marketing, business entity setup. So these are things that most businesses will need. And then you'll also need to spend on anything necessary to set up your particular type of business. So we can move to the next slide. Another requirement is that the business cannot be marginal. What this means is the business has to have the ability to make a substantial economic impact in the United States. And how this really translates is you have to hire workers. The business has to support more than just the investor and their family. And hiring U.S. employees is beneficial for the case, and then is required. Usually in the beginning, if you have a pure startup, you can show this through a business plan, and then if you want to renew, you would have to renew by showing you had hired workers. Another requirement is that the business has to be real and operating. So if you are, purchasing a business, you're already going to have, a lot of this proof, things like tax returns, invoices, lease agreements. If you're starting up a new company, then you're going to show that the business will be able to start operating once you get your visa, that everything is kind of already set up. So you've signed a commercial lease, your business entity is established, you've gotten any necessary licenses, you've created your website, maybe you have some preliminary contracts or letters of intent. Maybe you've set up your business bank account. All of these are kind of important for a startup to show that they're real and operating. You also have to show that you are going to develop and direct the E-2 business, that you're going to be active in running this business. Generally, showing that you meet the develop and direct requirement will be related to showing you have 50% ownership in the company, and therefore you have the ability to control the company and make those decisions for the company. But the point here is that the E-2 is not for someone who wants to kind of retire to the United States. It is something where you will have to actually develop and direct the company. That being said, the E-2 is also not for someone who just wants to come in and operate, for example, as a solo consultant. It is a situation where what they want is for you to be coming to build a business that will have a structure, that will hire employees, and make that strong economic impact in the United States. Another requirement is having the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the E-2 visa. Generally, this is satisfied by just including a signed statement saying you intend to depart the United States if or when the visa status ends. It does not prevent you from applying for a longer term green card in the future, but it is important that at the time that you apply, that you do have that non-immigrant intent where you do not intend to stay permanently. For the E-2, you can either start a new business, so you can kind of have a startup business where you're investing money to get things running, or you can buy an existing business. And one attractive feature about buying an existing business is that you can kind of protect your investment a bit more by using escrow. And so what this means is that they will consider that your funds are at risk and irrevocably committed if you are purchasing a business, but instead of transferring the money to the seller, you have a purchase sale agreement that has been signed that says every condition for finalizing this purchase has been satisfied except for the approval of the E-2 visa. So then the money gets transferred into escrow, and the escrow agent gets a set of instructions that say if the E-2 visa is approved, the money will be transferred to the seller. If the E-2 visa is denied, the money will go back to the buyer. So sometimes if people want to have kind of more protection for their investment and they're interested in purchasing a business as opposed to starting a new business, this can be an attractive option to use escrow, if the seller will agree to it. All right, how long is the E-2 visa valid? And so this will vary. It depends based on your country of nationality. There's something called a reciprocity schedule that the U.S. Department of State administers, and visas can be granted for sometimes as little as 3 months, up to 5 years. So for example, Egypt, Bangladesh, that you're getting kind of a 3-month visa, whereas somebody in London, somebody in Canada could get a visa that is valid for up to 5 years. Officers also have the discretion to limit the duration. So, for example, if they felt that it was a really weak case or they were concerned about the viability of the company, they might grant 2 years instead of 5 years. So this is something that they do have discretion to do. They do not have discretion to grant a higher amount than is permitted by the reciprocity schedule. No matter how long your visa is valid for, your visa is just an entry document. So it has to be valid for you to enter the United States. But when you enter, you will get something called an I-94. This is your status document. This is what proves your invalid status in the United States. And when you enter, you'll always get, or you should get, 2 years in E-2 status. So that's true if you have a 3-month visa. That's true if you have a 5-year visa. So when you enter, you always want to go online. There's a website where you check your I-94 to see what was I given 2 years in E-2 status. Sometimes there's mistakes, and then you have to contact the Customs and Border Protection Office to talk to them about, getting that corrected. If your passport also expires earlier than 2 years, they can sometimes limit the I-94, to the expiration of the passport. But just an important thing to keep in mind. So if you are someone from a country where you would only get a 3-month visa, that doesn't mean you only get 3 months to come in and run the company. You would get the 3-month visa. You would need to enter during the validity period, but then you could stay in the US for up to 2 years running that company in E-2 status. However, if you do depart the US, you would have to go back to a consulate and get a new visa before you could re-enter. So we can go to the next slide. All right. So how much investment is enough? This is a very common question that we get all the time. So you have to invest a substantial amount of money to qualify for the E-2, and there is no minimum set amount in the regulations. So sometimes E-2 is confused with EB-5, where that's a green card category where there's actual numbers. You have to invest a certain number. That's not the case for the E-2. It's much more malleable than that. Usually you're going to be investing more than $50,000. That might be, maybe $30,000 or $40,000 of that spent, and then some amount of working capital. Spending more is going to be more favorable for the application. But what you want to always think about is, what is the business I'm starting, and how much is needed to actually get that business up and running. What the government will do is look at a proportionality test. So how much money did you invest versus what are the usual costs to establish this type of business? It's always kind of more favorable to be able to say you've invested, 100% of what's needed to start up that type of business. For any kind of small investment amount, that's particularly important. So if you're starting a service-based company, a law firm, a consulting company, where there's kind of arguably very low startup costs, and you're investing, 50, 60, $70,000, you want to be able to argue you spent everything necessary to get the business up and running. This is in contrast to kind of a very large investment amount. Like, for example, if you were starting up a major manufacturing plant that required an investment of, $50 million, and you've invested $5 million. Even though percentage-wise you've invested a very low percentage, because the magnitude of the investment is so high, they may still consider this to be a substantial investment. So today we're kind of talking about more, lower investments and riskier cases, but just something to keep in mind. You always want to think about, what is the type of business I'm starting, and am I reasonably, investing what's needed to start that business? So, for example, an investment of $60,000 might work at certain consulates for a law firm. It's not going to work for a manufacturing plant, because they're just not going to believe that $60,000 is going to get you everything you need to actually start running a manufacturing plant. When we're buying a business, the way the proportionality test works is they're going to look at the purchase price and the fair market value of the business. Generally, if the business is being purchased on the open market, where there's kind of not a relationship between the buyer and the seller, they will consider that, whatever was being offered on the open market is the fair market value of the business and is a substantial investment. If you're purchasing a business from a friend, a family member, maybe you're buying into your brother-in-law's business, you really want to make sure that you have some objective evidence that your investment amount is the fair market value for that percentage of the business or for the totality of the business. So things like getting a valuation, from a CPA, or something like that, getting a separate valuation company, or at the very least that the tax returns and financials of the business and kind of showing how many assets it has, the income it has makes sense in light of your investment amount. So if it's an extremely profitable business earning millions, high amount of assets, high amount of income, and you're paying $20,000 to buy half that business, the officer may not believe that's really the fair market value. So things to keep in mind when you are, deciding which route to go. All right, so what are some strategies to deal with a low investment amount? So one would be you want to stress other factors that are positive about the application. So when you have a low investment amount, it's very important that every other aspect of the case is strong. So for example, if your investment amount is low, but you have 15 years of experience building, successful companies in this area, that's going to be really favorable for your application. Similarly, if you've hired some employees, maybe you hire a part-time office assistant or a couple employees to help you with marketing. This can be really positive for the case. Also, kind of the type of business, we'll talk about this later, kind of that there's, some kind of higher risk businesses where if you're doing that type of business, they're more likely to look at this with more scrutiny. So, if you're purchasing, an existing tangible business with employees, these are things that can be really favorable for an application, even if the investment amount is lower. Also very helpful to obtain contracts or letters of intent from clients. For marginality with a pure startup, what they're worried about is, are you really going to be able to get this business to the point where it's making this, strong economic contribution? If you already show there's interest in your business, that's going to be really favorable for your case. Also, a Chamber of Commerce letter can sometimes be helpful. Showing you're making inroads in the business community. Sometimes if you are in that area where your business is being set up, if you join the Chamber of Commerce and maybe have a meeting with them, they might write a letter saying, they're excited for your business entering their community, that it's going to create jobs and be a positive economic benefit. This can sometimes be helpful. If there is any ongoing company activity, let's say you've already started performing on a contract because you're outside the US, so there's not concerns about work authorization. This is very favorable as well. A strong business plan is really key. So just showing this is what the business is going to do. This is our market for the business. This is our marketing plan. This is why it's going to be viable from a financial perspective. Here's how we're going to hire people. That's very important. Hiring employees prior to applying, I mentioned that earlier, just that's always going to be favorable from your case from two perspectives. One is that anything you pay to the employee or anything you pay to kind of get a payroll provider set up or insurance, all of those are very strong E-2 expenditures, so it can raise your investment amount. And then it also is very helpful for marginality to show you already meet that requirement, that the business is already going to support more than just the investor and their family. A CPA letter can also sometimes be helpful. Let's say you have a CPA who has worked in, your industry or with kind of small and mid-sized businesses in your industry, and they would look at your investment schedule and your business plan and write a letter opining that this is a reasonable amount for this type of business to get the business up and running. This can also be helpful for the application. Okay, so what are some common E-2 expenditures? So as I mentioned, you do want to think about what is my business and what does my business need? Have I spent everything to get the business up and running? That being said, there's always going to be some expenditures that every business will need. So website setup and hosting. Very often, kind of if you're going to the consulate or you're applying for a change of status, they will look up your website to see, what's on there. Is it set up? If it isn't set up yet or it's not public yet, you can always share that information with them or give them access so they can see that it would be ready to run once you got your visa. Strong expenditures would be kind of computer, printer, scanner, tablets, iPads if they're used for work, any inventory, furniture, but only if used for business purposes. So it's not helpful, for example, to say I'm bought myself a dining room table because I'm going to work at home. That's not going to be helpful. Legal fees can also be included, including legal fees paid to your immigration lawyer, although those are kind of less of a strong expense than, for example, legal fees paid to a corporate lawyer to help you with your business setup or your business plan, or to help with some other aspect of your transaction. Lease, and you can also prepay. So for example, if you are getting commercial office space and your investment amount's on the lower side and you're not sure what to spend money on, You could potentially pay for, 6 to 12 months of a lease, software, advertising, office supplies, all things that kind of any normal business would need to operate. All right, so what are some weak expenditures? So these are things where we generally won't even include them because you don't get the benefit you get from having a higher investment amount is kind of lessened by the fact that the officer will consider it a weak expense and may look at your case less favorably overall. So one would be kind of flights, any travel expenses, anything like meals, transportation, taxis. They're really not, they don't view these very favorably. If there's a very specific business related conference or business related activity, that might be able to be included, but you don't want this to be the bulk of your investment amount. A car or a vehicle, this sometimes can be a strong expenditure, but it really depends on what type of business you have. So if you're using a car and that's your expense, and your expense is just, well, I'm going to use this for business and personal use, and I just need a way to get to work, that's not a good expenditure. However, if you're doing a food truck, then obviously the truck that you purchase will be useful. If you have a construction company, a renovation company, and you need a work truck, then a car or a vehicle becomes a stronger expense. Um, Also, just watching out for kind of expenses paid to related parties. So sometimes maybe an investor has multiple businesses that they own. Maybe they have, their husband or spouse owns a business. Paying, it can be risky to kind of do too many of these types of expenditures. So, for example, we wouldn't recommend. Let's say you have a company, outside the U.S. that does website setup. You want your U.S. company to pay that company to set up the website. It's not that it's prohibited. You can do it, but it could look weaker because the officer could look at that and say, well, we think you haven't put any money at risk. You just transferred money from one place, one business you own to another business you own. So better to kind of use U.S. vendors and better to use it where it's clear your money is kind of at risk in the commercial sense. Perfect. So let's talk about some challenges of specific businesses. And one of these is consulting businesses. And these are very common for the E2. We do a lot of these. They can be very successful for the E2, but they have challenges. So one major challenge is that theoretically a very low investment or sometimes no investment is needed to start a consulting business. Very commonly, clients will come to us and say, I have my knowledge, I have my networks, I have a laptop. I don't need anything else. How could I possibly get this visa? I can't spend this amount of money. So because it is an investor visa, sometimes what you would do as an entrepreneur and what you would do to get the visa can be in tension with one another. So as we advise our clients, what we want you to do is not to just spend money, that's useless to you, but look ahead a couple years. What would your major expenses be in the first couple of years of your business? And can you bring any of those forward to now? So you're spending money on things you would have purchased anyway, but you're spending that money now because you need to do it in order to get the E-2 visa, because the officer really has to see you spent enough to show you're committed to successfully operating the business. So these can be things like prepaying for office space, maybe prepaying for equipment. Let's say you plan to hire an employee at the end of the year or in 2 years. Maybe you purchase the computer equipment for that employee now instead of waiting 2 years. Investing in marketing. You may be okay with a very bare bones website, but maybe in a couple of years you would have revamped that. So maybe you pay for that now. Hiring employees. So, many people will find it's helpful, especially if they're outside the US. Maybe it's helpful for them to have a contractor, or a W-2 employee as an office assistant who can kind of do some initial things on the ground for them. And anything you pay to that contractor or employee can be part of your investment amount. You also want to spend over a large number of categories because, again, what you're doing is telling the officer, I've spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running. So making one $40,000 expenditure on a very, fancy website and then paying $5 for pens, that's not going to be a good breakdown of the investment schedule. You really want it to be kind of logically looking at this investment schedule. Would an officer believe, yeah, they have everything they need. They have their computer, they have their software, they've got their insurance, they have an office space. So you want to think about that strategically, and especially then if you have a specialty type of business, consulting in a particular area and you need certain software for that. You want to make sure you're explaining all of that. It can also be helpful to, get articles that show these are the normal costs to get this business up and running. For example, Entrepreneur Magazine will often kind of put out articles. This is what it costs to open a software consulting business, or and then if you can kind of get those industry, research articles and show, hey, it says you can start this with $5,000. I've spent $50,000. This can be also compelling for your case. So we can move to the next slide. Perfect. So real estate. So real estate is an area where if you're going to do an E2 in this industry, you know that the officer is going to be looking at your case very closely. Part of the reason is that there's sometimes confusion people have that they can kind of purchase a property, put it, in the name of an LLC, and that is a substantial investment. And so the concern there is that just having, passive real estate ownership does not qualify for the E2. And so the E2 investor in this area needs to prove that this is a real and operating enterprise. It's actually going to, generate revenue, hire employees. You're not just kind of, owning a couple properties and collecting passive real estate, or rental income. So here's some ideas that, clients of ours have done in the past. So a real estate, brokerage firm, a property management company, where you're managing kind of maybe a couple properties you own, but also properties other people own, real estate renovation and construction. Also house flipping, but again, this one they'll look at you with a lot of scrutiny. If, for example, we had a client who did this, but they had a portfolio of about 30 to 40 homes, or another client who was doing a large scale commercial, development project. Obviously, these investment amounts had to be much higher because of, the nature of the business. If you're interested in house flipping, but you really are only doing it on a small scale, you may want to consider having, for example, a property management company or a renovation company, and then having house flipping as more of an ancillary side service that you offer. And that can be kind of contemplated in your business plan. But it is important as well that you just consider, which state are you setting up in? Real estate, if you're doing a brokerage, if you're doing construction, very often you do need specific licenses. And, so you want to make sure you're taking that into account when you're coming up with your plan for the E2. Okay, equity trading companies. So this is another area, a lot of similarities to real estate in terms of the risks and how officers might see these. So, placing your stock portfolio in the name of an LLC doesn't qualify. The concern there is, they think, are you just doing day trading? Are you just doing personal investing? Is this really a business that's going to generate income? You want to have clients that are generally going beyond just kind of your friends and family. You want to show how your business is going to be active enough to hire workers in the US. And it's also a very highly regulated industry. So for example, if you're setting up a hedge fund, there's a lot that goes into that. And there's generally going to be multiple structures that you have, and you want to make sure that you're able to explain to an officer which one you'll be working for, which one will be the E2 company, and how the whole flow of companies will operate together. So you have to convince that officer that your business is not passive and that you're not just kind of doing personal investing. All right. So, what are some reasons for E2 visa denials? So, one would be low investment amount. We've talked about some strategies today for how you can deal with low investment amounts. However, there'll be some investments that are just too low. We did have a client once who came to us who had spent $2,000 and put $98,000 in a business bank account. And the officer said to this person, get a B1 business visitor visa and, figure out how you can spend more. So this person then came to us. We helped advise them. They ended up spending about 50,000 with about 50,000 in cash for a total investment of 100,000, and were ultimately approved. Nature of the business can be another concern. So we've just talked about, there's certain types of industries where they're going to look at you more closely. Real estate, consulting, equity trading are just a few of those. Filing location and venue are also very important. So there are certain consulates where, even though the law is the same, because there's no minimum set investment amount, there are trends at consulates. So For example, some consulates may see huge multinational companies that are sending lots of E-2 employees. They may be less friendly to the smaller investor who's investing $100,000 if what they normally see are investments of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars from these huge companies. Um, Whereas there's other venues, for example, like Toronto, London, or if you're filing with change of status with USCIS, where they seem more receptive to kind of smaller investment amounts that are around the $100,000 mark or even a little bit lower. Um, if you have run a similar business in your home country for many years and you never hired employees, this can be a very big concern for marginality. In that case, you really may want to hire somebody before you file to kind of mitigate that concern because they may not be willing to rely on a business plan when they have 10 years of history showing you never hired anybody. Um, so that's also the same as the one underneath. Issues with the adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They have different levels of training. They have good days and bad days. They have different assumptions about certain types of businesses. If you feel that you got a very unfair officer or one that misapplied the law, for example, one that insisted you couldn't qualify without employees or what have you, there are very limited options to kind of contest this and none that are very fast. Usually the easiest mechanism is to just reapply, and most consulates will try to give you a different officer. It's not guaranteed, but in our experience, they do really try to do that. Another reason might be you didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes we have people come to us where they've filed on their own or perhaps with an attorney who's not as familiar with the requirements. And maybe, they purchased a business, but the entire business is seller financing where the amount is secured by the E-2 company. In that instance, no investment has been made. Or maybe the treaty country national doesn't own 50% of the business or can't control or operate the business. If you don't meet the requirements, ultimately, just in an objective way, you would look at that, try to, reapply after you've, addressed that concern. Okay, let's turn to some adjudication trends. So the government does post different kind of, approval rates and statistics. Approval rates for E-2s are generally quite high, around 80 to 90%. We do have a very high approval rate as well. However, of course, past results do not predict future outcomes. No one can ever guarantee that you will get your visa. That being said, we do have extensive experience helping people successfully navigate this process. In terms of timelines, so this is going to vary between consulates. If you are going to London right now, for example, they say 90 business days, 90 working days is their review time. So quite a long time where you're submitting and then waiting several months before you're called for your interview. In Toronto, timelines have kind of changed recently. For a very long time, they were kind of consistent at about a 15 business day review time, and then an ability to get an interview within maybe a couple weeks. Recently, that has changed somewhat, where their review times are extending a bit, maybe out to 20 business days, maybe a little bit longer, and then getting an interview. Sometimes it can be still within a few weeks. Sometimes it's taking, a month or more. So you do want to build that into your planning in general, when you're thinking about timelines, again, like it's very specific to the consulate you're applying at. And as I just mentioned with Toronto, these timelines can change. So it is important to discuss with your attorney what is the, most recently, available, information that we have. Sometimes consulates will go through phases where they're training people, or right now, there's lots of policy changes, which can mean that staff, need more time to be trained. It can mean, fewer appointments. For example, an interview, waiver policy guidance just changed significantly, so more people need to be interviewed. So timelines are shifting. I will say when people ask about timelines for E-2s, I tell them you want to think in months, not days or weeks. It's happening. Very unlikely you'd be able to just apply and get an interview and get your visa within, a few weeks. That's not going to happen. But a few months, very very viable at many consulates. All right, moving to USCIS filings versus a consulate filing. So when you're doing an E-2, in terms of venue, you kind of have two options. If you're outside the United States, you can file at the consulate in your home country or where you're resident, where you have a passport. If you're inside the United States in a status that allows you to change your status, for example, you entered on a B1 business visitor visa, or maybe you're on an H1B and you want to start a business, you can file a change of status with USCIS. And there's kind of different benefits to each. So with USCIS, one benefit is if you're in the US, you don't have to leave. Everything is kind of done on the papers. You will mail a petition to USCIS. If they approve you, you'll get an approval notice. This approval notice, though, does not allow international travel. It doesn't function like a visa. And when you leave the United States, you will have to submit a brand new application at the consulate. So there's some kind of visa types where getting an approval with USCIS means almost a rubber stamp at the consulate. That's not the case with the E-2. With the E-2, the consulate will not rely on the approval of USCIS. They will adjudicate it as a brand new case. So that's kind of one potential downside, is that you are not able to kind of travel internationally. However, you are able to remain in the United States. You don't have to attend an interview. And there's more ability to have insight into timing, because you can pay an additional fee to get a response within 15 business days. That can be an approval, denial, or request for more evidence. If it's a request for more evidence, you're going to submit a response, and then you'll get that final decision within the 15 business days if you pay that extra fee. Benefits of a consulate are that you're actually going to get a visa stamp in your passport. So for somebody who's, for example, Canadian, or a UK resident, you can get a 5-year visa as opposed, that allows you to travel internationally, as opposed to just a 2-year approval. So for many people, the consulate is kind of a better option for that reason. USCIS can also be they're willing to accept lower investment amounts, but they are much stricter in reviewing the source and trail of funds. So if you have a very complex source and trail of funds where money has kind of gone multiple places, even though it's your personal savings, USCIS filing can be kind of more difficult than a consular filing, where they might take a more high level view and be willing to approve it just based on your tax returns, as opposed to needing to see the flow of funds, from your payroll all the way until it's spent on the E-2 expenditures. Moving, down to post-specific considerations. So every consulate, and then USCIS as well, has kind of their own way they want things done. They want things formatted. Consulates will generally have instructions for exactly how you should submit, the case to them. They often will have page limits, file size limits, and if it's not sent in the right way, they'll send it back. So you do want to be very attentive to that, because they are quite strict. Consular preferences, we talked a little bit about this. Some consulates are going to be used to seeing much larger companies. They may be less friendly to kind of smaller investors, and this will change over time as well, because foreign service officers will serve for a certain amount of time, and then they will change consulates. So there can be times where one consulate maybe was really, really difficult, with E-2s, and then maybe they get a new consular chief, and maybe that starts to change, or it can go the other way, where it becomes more difficult than it's been in the past as a result of a change in the adjudicators. Also important to note, some consulates will require that your business plan have a CPA certification. So for example, in Mexico, when you submit your business plan, they want a certification that a CPA has actually reviewed and validated, the financial statements. This is something where we do offer the service of assisting with drafting the business plan, and we also have a CPA on staff. So this is something we could also help with as part of your E-2 process. Okay, so some issues in complex areas to keep in mind. Do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E-2 visa? The answer is no, this is not a requirement. That being said, there are some consulates that seem to kind of say it's a requirement. It is not, so there is kind of a legal basis to push back on that. That being said, if you're going to a consulate where they strongly favor it, you may decide, hey, it's worthwhile to hire somebody ahead of time, just to get in front of that issue. Complicated source and trail of funds. So as I mentioned previously, USCIS will take a very granular look at your source and trail of funds. So if, let's say, you got, a gift from your mother, they won't just accept a gift letter. They want to know, where did your mother get that money? If it was personal savings from her employment, they're going to want to see her tax returns. They're going to want to see the money entering her bank account from her company, being sustained there. If she transferred it to savings, they're going to want to see it being transferred there up until it's actually gifted to you. So if it's, it can be very simple. Let's say you took out a, home equity line of credit, and you have the home equity agreement. you have proof of the money being transferred to you, that's going to be very simple to document that. But, for many people, it's more complex. Maybe they're getting, from multiple, maybe it's been saved over multiple years. Maybe it's someone's inheritance, someone's pension. So if it's very complex, the USCIS filing can be more difficult. Loans and gifts are permitted in certain circumstances. So with gifts, that's fine. However, the gift giver must be willing to share, the information to prove that it's a legitimate source of funds. So they have to be willing to share that sensitive financial information. Loans are permitted if they are personal loans that are secured by your personal assets or unsecured loans. They just cannot be secured by assets of the E-2 business. Um, People sometimes ask, can you get two investor E2s? And you can, but the ownership in that case has to be 50-50 for both people to be considered investors. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. So sometimes people will get a visa, like a 5-year visa, and they think, great, I'm authorized to work. And while that's true, you have to keep in mind that, you have to continue to meet the requirements in order for the visa to continue to be valid. So if you no longer own 50% of your company, let's say you sell the majority of it to a US partner, that can change. That means that your company is no longer an E2 company. Or let's say that you had a wedding photography business and you decide, I don't want to do that. I want to open a restaurant. And you just open the restaurant. Now you violated your status because that was not the business that was presented to the consulate. So if you do want to make that change, what you have to do is get an approval before you make the change. So a change in ownership, you just can't fall below 50%. In terms of a change in the type of business, you would need to go, if there's a substantial change, you're going to need to go back to the consulate or go back to USCIS and kind of submit that documentation, before you make the change. One thing you can consider though is if hey, I'm doing software consulting services right now, but in 3 years, I really want to get into mobile app development. You can kind of contemplate that in your initial business plan. And sometimes that can be a way to, avoid having to go back to the consulate at a later stage, because if it's not a substantial change, if you've made them aware that this isn't your business plan. Um, Family business purchases. So I talked about this a bit earlier. They're going to be looked at with more scrutiny. If you are purchasing from a family member, please make sure that you have a valuation or some objective criteria that shows you purchased for the fair market value of the business. The impact of the current administration. So lots of executive orders have come out, obviously, about immigration. There were previous executive orders, such as Hire American, Buy American, which kind of indicated their thought process, which is that they want evidence of, positive economic impact to the United States. So, we can kind of expect to see them looking for higher investment amounts, higher employee numbers, and in particular, higher employee numbers of US citizens or legal permanent residents. That is something that they look at on the forms. They will specifically ask. Also, investments in the US. So it's not a requirement that you make your investment in the US, but it's much better for your case if you do. So if you have a choice, for example, between using a vendor in Canada or one in the US, better to pay the vendor in the US. That's going to strengthen your case more than paying the vendor in Canada. We will note that E2 approval rates did not change much from 2016 to 2020, and we have not seen, any big impact yet either. All right, so we've reached the end of the presentation, and we can see if looks like one question has come in. Have you seen any changes in the way the law is applied today? Amounts need to be higher, employees must be hired from the start. So again, kind of not uniformly, but I think generally all visa applications are receiving more scrutiny. And so it's good to do everything you can to make your case as strong as possible, including investing a higher amount, or hiring employees. So if you do have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat box. If we don't get any in the next couple minutes, we will go ahead and close the session. Um, so someone's asked, is there any minimum investment? So we went over for the E2, there is not a set minimum investment amount. It's going to depend on the type of business that you're starting. That being said, we generally don't recommend applying with an investment under 50,000. So for service-based businesses, you want to be thinking about, 50,000 or higher. And again, that's going to depend on where you're applying, the type of business you have. For anyone who joined late, I would also recommend just looking at the entire presentation on YouTube as we go over that in a lot of detail. I guess the PowerPoint will be sent to everybody. So someone's asked, how is cash flow needed to run the business considered in the initial investment? So again, like what they're looking at is, have you invested everything to get the business up and running? So having they're not going to necessarily look at your year one cash flow and say, how much do you need to run for the entire year? But your business plan should demonstrate that the business will start to earn revenue at an amount that will allow the business to sustain itself and hire employees. All right. Somebody's asked, I'm currently on an E-2 for an employer. Would it be possible for me to apply for my own E-2 while being in the US on another E-2? So yes, this is possible. As long as you're kind of maintaining your status, you can apply to, amend your status. It is also possible to kind of work for an E-2 employer and also run your own business, but it has to make sense in light of the employment. So if your employment is full-time, they may not accept that you can do both. But in some circumstances you can, but you definitely can also kind of apply to, just be your own investor and run your own company. Can you stay in the US while a case is filed? So this will depend, if you're, for example, if you're on a B1, and you're in your valid status and you apply to change your status, you're permitted to stay here until the final decision is rendered. If you're applying at a consulate, that doesn't, give you any ability to kind of stay in the US. What if I submit inside the US to a change of status to USAS, but travel internationally? If you submit inside the US and then you travel before there's a decision, your case will be considered abandoned. If you're Canadian, generally, like if you're taking there's something called automatic visa revalidation that you might be able to use if you have a valid passport in your passport. But that's a very kind of specific situation. I would say for most people in your situation, once you leave the United States and travel internationally, you'll need to go to the consulate and get a valid E-2 visa in your passport. You can't kind of travel back in and out just using the USCIS approval. That would not work. If the business does not run well, is it okay at the renewal? When you go to renew, they're going to want to see that the business still meets all the E-2 requirements, and they're also going to want to see that you have, hired people, that your revenues are increasing. If the business is not doing very well, it doesn't mean your renewal will definitely be denied, but you'll probably need to submit maybe another business plan showing how you're getting the business back on track. We did this a lot during COVID when businesses were kind of in a slump. So the important thing there is that if the business has not done very well, that you can show that you have a plan to get it back on track and what efforts you've made over the years to get it to be successful. That being said, there's certain, like if the business has just never made any money, never hired anyone, then no, likely you would not be able to renew. Someone's asked, what's the next step if you'd like to use our services? So if you'd like to use our services, you would go ahead and either schedule a consultation with us on our website. The link to our website is on this PowerPoint. We'll also be sending an email afterwards. If you'd like to speak to us further, the next step would usually be to schedule a consultation, or if you feel like you'd like to go ahead, you can contact us by email and we would send you our engagement letter outlining our fees and services. An E-2 visa holder can work for that business as well as anywhere else, or are they bound to work only at the E-2 company? You can only work for your E-2 company. So getting an E-2 visa is not kind of a blanket work authorization that lets you work anywhere. You are allowed to work for the company, that you've presented at the consulate. That being said, if you have a spouse and the spouse is getting an E-2 spousal visa, the spouse can work anywhere. So that spouse will get kind of work authorization to work anywhere, but the E-2 investor is limited to only working at the E-2 company. All right, so I think those are all the questions we had. Thank you everyone for your great questions. Thank you, Katie. We're going to close here and please look out for the email with the information. Thank you.